Blair, 0345 6060 973, and you can watch us on Global Player.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock. The Prime Minister has told the COP27 summit that the UK is tripling its funding to help with the impacts of climate change. Rishi Sunak has said a lot of progress has already been made since COP26 in Glasgow.
Just 1/3 of the global economy was signed up to net zero. Today, it is 90%. And for our part, the UK will fulfil our ambitious commitment to reduce emissions by at least 68% by 2030.
The amount the UK will contribute will increase to £1.5 billion, which will be spent on helping nations adapt to a changing climate. Earlier today, the UN Secretary-General warned that we're on a highway to climate hell. Police have arrested 23 people after environmental demonstrations on the M25. Just Stop Oil protesters climbed up on gantries, which meant traffic had to be stopped. And the owners of Liverpool Football Club have said they are open to offers. It follows reports that they're up for sale. Fenway Sports Group insists they're committed to success both on and off the pitch. In the city, the FTSE 100 is closed down 35 points at 7,200. The pound buys $1.15 and €1.15. LBC weather, rain in the west, easing as it moves eastwards overnight, leaving clear spells and blustery showers. A low of 8. Windy with a mix of sunshine and showers tomorrow, some thundery and heaviest in the west. A high of 14 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Josh Bancroft.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, very good evening. It's coming up to 2 minutes past 8 on LBC. I'm Iain Dale with Monday's Cross Question for you. Our panel tonight, on my immediate left, John McTernan, who is political strategist. He was the Director of Political Operations for Tony Blair. We have Dame Caroline Dinenage, Conservative MP for Gosport. To my immediate right, Thangam Debbonaire, Shadow Leader of the House of Commons and Labour MP for Bristol West. And to her right, Christopher, and in fact, to everybody's right, Christopher Hope, Associate Editor for Politics of the Daily Telegraph and host of the brilliant Choppers Political podcast. 0345 6060 973. This is the number you need if you'd like to ask our panel a question. You can do so by text on 84850. And if you ask Alexa, send a comment to LBC, you can do it that way as well. And don't forget, you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Let's start with a text question from Kimberly in Poole. Is COP27 just a greenwashing talking shop? That's what Greta Thunberg has called it, isn't it, Thangam?
Well, I mean, I think it's important that, given that climate crisis is the greatest crisis we face as a world, that we are getting world leaders together every year. Unfortunately, not all of them are there, and I think that's very much to the bad. But it's crucially important. I think it's particularly important that Rishi Sunak's there. It was very, very unfortunate that he did a bit of a hokey-cokey with it. Will he, won't he? He wouldn't, and then he might, and now he's there for a little bit of it. I would have liked him to have been there for the full length and to have shown full-throated commitment from the start.
To be fair, no world leader stays for the full length.
I would, but he didn't. He wasn't going to go at all to begin with, and I think that's why it looks like a bad look. It's a bad look, isn't it? And not to have gone straight away. But I'm glad he has, because the thing is, the economy depends on us fixing climate crisis as well as vice versa.
But why don't we reserve our fire for those who deliberately boycott it, like China and India? Because they are the main polluters.
I would like them to be there as well. I'd particularly like them to be there. I think it's really important.
But do you think that's why Greta Thunberg called it a talking shop? Because those who are the biggest polluters aren't there?
Well, I can't speak for Greta Thunberg, and as I said, I wish that Mr. Modi and Xi Jinping were there. However, there is still important work to be done. Small island nations and other developing countries are particularly keen that we talk about loss and damage, and I'm glad that that's going to happen. But there's any amount of work to be done. Yes, it would be better if China and India were there, but there's still work that can be done without them.
Now, you raised this whole issue of loss and damage, which is being called reparations. Ed Miliband was talking about this subject yesterday. Some people are saying that he believes that there should be climate reparations to poorer countries from richer countries that have been the biggest polluters over the decades. It's not a very clear message from Ed Miliband. Can I put it that way?
Well, loss and damage means exactly what it says, and as I understand it, we're exactly in tune actually with government policy on this, which is that it's important that as a richer country, we are helping poorer countries with the costs of climate crisis, because we will all be damaged if we don't fix the problems in other countries. It will affect us as well. It will affect us in numerous ways. That's the sort of problem that it is. Are you saying
that we should help with particular projects, and that if we provide aid money, development money to poorer countries, that's a good thing? Or are you, I mean, reparations would seem to suggest you hand over, I don't know, £100 billion and then people spend it on what they like.
I don't think the COP conference is calling it reparations, and neither am I. I'm calling it loss and damage, which is how it's referred to at the conference, and those are the two words that are important here.
Caroline Dinenage, is it just a talking shop?
Well, no, it's not, is it? I mean, but it always fails to deliver quite the conclusion, quite the definitive conclusion that the world wants and needs. But the fact is, if we can edge ever so slowly, but ever so slightly towards some kind of solution that the world can buy into, that's really the only way forward. It's dreadful that some of the worst polluters are not there to take part, because quite frankly we're never going to solve this issue unless we get buy-in from the likes of China and India. They need to be at the table. But I remember when we came to the end of COP26 meetings in Scotland, that there was disappointment that we hadn't got as far as we wanted to go. But still, under the presidency of the UK, they came together and committed £100 billion worth of global funding to support less developed countries. So, it's made a significant start.
But if you look at it from the point of view of China and India, they're basically saying, well, you've had your industrial revolution, we're having ours. How dare you lecture us on the fact that you don't want us to develop in the same way that you had? You can kind of understand where they're coming from. Yeah,
you can. And of course, there's absolutely no doubt that the UK was at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution, hundreds of years ago, and that there are some smaller countries who've done very little to contribute to climate change that are feeling the worst effects of it so far. But China and India are not little countries, and actually, had we had the knowledge and the expertise and the science and the IT and all the developments that we have now, back when the Industrial Revolution happened to us a couple of hundred years ago, I'd like to think that we would have liked to have taken up the benefits. Nobody would have been out there with their thrashing machine if they could have had a combine harvester, would they?
Oh, memories of driving a combine harvester at the age of 8. Imagine that nowadays. John McTernan.
I'm trying to imagine you driving a combine harvester, actually.
I've spent many a happy hour.
And I've never driven one myself. Yes, it's a talking shop, but all international diplomacy is talking. And unless we talk and have a proper conversation, we never come to agreements. Is it important that China and India commit to achieving the targets? Yes. And to be honest, you don't need to burn coal in the 21st century, because we actually invented nuclear power last century. And nuclear has to be a huge part of moving to a decarbonised economy. But I think it's really important that it comes every year. I think it's really important to address the loss and damage, because I was listening to somebody from one of the small islands saying, 2% is devastation for us. 1.5% is just destruction, and probably already, I would think.
You mean a 2-degree rise in
2-degree rise in global temperatures. I was talking to Dave Miliband earlier this year, and he says that climate change is just about, or already is, the single biggest driver of refugees. It's bigger than conflict, and it's in all of our interest to deal with climate change, because we don't want billions of people dislocated. People should be able to live sustainably in the areas where they're born, where they want to be in their communities. And I think that's another reason why we need to work collectively. And I can understand why the Americans aren't there, because it's an election period for them. I can understand why the Australians aren't there. There's in India and Asia.
Joe Biden is there. Or will be.
Will be there. He's not there at the moment.
No, he's not there at the moment.
He's going there later on.
Tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly.
Chris Hope, now, this programme likes to regard itself as the mouthpiece of the Daily Telegraph. We had your environment, your environment correspondent on, who's actually at Sharm el-Sheikh. Right. she didn't seem to be particularly hopeful that anything meaningful would be agreed at this COP27. How important is it that it isn't just seen as a talking shop, or greenwashing talking shop, as Greta Thunberg called it?
It is important. I mean, I think Rishi Sunak is doing the job he's born into, to be on the global stage at a big conference. Looks fantastic, representing this country. I think it is a degree of talking. I mean, Greta Thunberg is correct in that. In the old days, I mean, Tony Blair very rarely went to these events, nor did I think Cameron went once. I mean, it was very rare that the PM would go. Not 2 years running. I suppose we are handing over our presidency of COP to Egypt this time. That's why we've gone. But I think it's important. You can easily label a hypocrisy at them. Certainly, Nicola Sturgeon's under fire for going out there and spending all sorts of, using up her carbon quota to go out to talk about the environment. But I think it's important to do it. But look at those numbers here. I mean, the UK with 3% of global emissions so far in history, and the US at 20%, and China 11% and rising. These are the big polluters. Australia shouldn't get a free pass on this. I mean, they are one of the world's biggest coal exporters. Why aren't they there? They should be there for all their virtue signalling on other parts of our environmental policies.
Given they've got a Labour government now, you'd have thought that they would attend.
Yeah, I think it's shocking Australia's now.
They used to be there.
They get completely free pass all the time.
Albert's at ASEAN. He's at the most important economic meeting for the region. So I think there's a representative from Australia there, from the ministry, but not the Prime Minister.
Isn't it odd how they schedule two international conferences to take place at the same time? I think my big take from COP27 so far is that Rishi Sunak is actually shorter than Emmanuel Macron.
Yeah.
Who knew?
Hey. 5 foot
no
2
wonder
in his
Macron's
socks.
being really nice to him.
Yeah, exactly. And he can lord it over.
Nothing said against people of 5'2", thank you. Speaking for a friend.
Right, let's move on to Sean in concert. Hello, Sean.
Hello, panel. I'll tell you what it is, hey. Can you tell me, right, this is the God's honest truth, and I want a truth answer, right? The COP27 is for powerful people, right? What the hell is Johnson doing over there?
Well, I can answer that one.
Go on.
Well, it's politics, I'm afraid, Sean. That's why he's gone. He's gone there to show up as he thought when he said he was going to go. Rishi Sunak wasn't going to go. He sees himself as being some form of the conscience of the Glasgow COP meeting in COP26. So he went there to force Sunak to go, and guess what? Sunak went.
Is that being cynical, or do you genuinely think that?
I'm being a bit cynical. Sorry, Sean. It's my political hat. I'm in Westminster here with my cynical political hat on. I mean, he does believe in it. I mean, I think he gets credit for that. He certainly pushed the Tory party further down the green path than many MPs said they wanted to go. But I think he's gone because he thinks he's got unfinished business. The environment, COP26, and Ukraine are the two big issues. I should say he did leave early from COP26 last year and come back for a dinner in London, didn't he?
And that's why his problem started. Of course, that was the famous dinner where they decided to try and save Owen Patterson.
Well, about a year ago.
And then his troubles began. Yeah, his troubles began.
It's gone very well since then.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Caroline.
Yeah.
Alternative timeline.
Caroline, is Chris being overly cynical? Why do you think Boris Johnson is at COP27?
Well, why not? 2 prime ministers for the price of one. I don't know.
Where's this trust?
They could have 3.
She's on her way. And actually, it just underlines the commitment of this country, this government, to trying to find solutions to some of these issues we face as a world. I don't see there's any issue with it.
And why isn't Tony Blair there, John?
Tony can't be everywhere.
Yes. Well,
He's not our Lord.
sometimes it seems as though...
Controversial. Distancing myself from the...
Doesn't do God.
Tony then.
I mean, being serious, given the work of his institute, I mean, it's not just world leaders that are there, though. I mean, this is a huge event. You have lots of lobbyists there.
Something big is definitely happening about COP. Many corporates who I know who used to go to the World Economic Forum are stopping going to that because that expresses a set of values they don't want to be associated with, Davos man and rapacious capitalism, and they're now turning up at COP. COP is getting more of a fringe. That's why Boris Johnson's there to be a fringe performer, much like there's a fringe at Tory party and Labour Party conferences. And so Yeah, in that sense, you could that will grow. So there's not, it's, annual COPs will build to be a bigger event. There will be more corporates, and I think a lot of corporate. You could this morning was really interesting to hear Chief Executive of Ryanair, and then later on today Willie Walsh from IATA, both basically going, yes, there is a problem about airlines. The debate is moving. They both try to defend ways they can decarbonise that industry. What Tony does in this space is he just pushes out papers, and they're there for people to take up. The detail of the negotiation is really down to governments, and in the end, governments have to get ideas from somewhere. There's ideas from the Tony Blair Institute, but they have to come to agreements. That's why it's a talking shop. You've got to talk and talk and talk and talk. Remember the one that I was told by a diplomat, there's a big mistake at the Copenhagen one that Ed went to. People always book 2 extra days after any big diplomatic discussion because they know they might run over. The Copenhagen one ran over, but they hadn't booked the centre for the extra days, and so Copenhagen had to stop. Ed got up in his pajamas. He got up in his pajamas at 2 a.m. to go and negotiate bits of the treaty, but actually they couldn't run over. So you need a bit of flex for.
Isn't it interesting what John says there, Iain, about businesses seeing this now as the place to be? And I think that really illustrates the fact that there is no good economic growth without tackling climate change. They are not just coterminous, but they help each other.
Why isn't Keir Starmer there?
Well, as John just said, he's not the government, and Keir Starmer has been as Tony Blair.
No, he was. He was the minister. He was the minister sent by Gordon.
Yeah. And pushing out policy papers. I mean, Labour's Green Prosperity Plan, which would triple onshore wind, triple offshore wind, increase solar, invest in new nuclear. There are things that we're pushing out there which I very much hope Rishi Sunak
Keir sent the Prime Minister to deliver the Labour agenda, because we called it green growth, and now Rishi's called it clean growth. There's not, imitation is the greatest form.
Who's going to pay the bill for all this? Who's going to pay for the bill for all this onshore surge?
I think it's astonishing when a commentator from the right asks me that. The moment after the 3 months we've had with Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss's programme of non-accountability for any sort of economic growth whatsoever, and just sort of making stuff up, they are the reason why we've had an economic crisis. So I think ask them where they're going to get any money. But I can answer the question, by the way, which is we would spend £28 billion, or we would invest that. And yes, that means investing to grow, just like you have a mortgage. And that's a good thing.
You always use the word invest when what you mean is borrow.
What do you call your mortgage, Iain? What do you call your mortgage? Yes, you can, actually, because it's about investing in the future. Ian, also saying we have a future which is worth putting money into, because it will grow, because it would. Have you seen the latest debt figures?
Yes,
what we need to, but they're being spent on covering a really rubbish budget and numerous other economic failures. And a lot of this will be spending powering the jobs of the future, reducing people's bills, increasing the tax as more people go into work and into well-paid jobs, and tackle climate change.
And a lot of the investment in energy production will come from the private sector.
Yes.
They're being stopped by planning legislation, by government edict, really, from developing solar and onshore wind where it should be. And so a lot of the investment will come to create the energy of the future. And if we don't make our economy decarbonised and competitive, then we'll lose to the Germans. Scholz, the reason why there's a meeting with Scholz today is partly that Scholz has an idea that you can reindustrialise Germany by shifting to a decarbonised economy. And if we don't get in there as well, then you'll see Germany once ahead in industrialisation.
Why would we not be the world leaders of all of these industries? Why would we not want those jobs to be spreading around from Wigan to Worcester and from
Andy
Dorset
has
to
a
Dover?
complaint.
Andy
he says, will you all stop laughing amongst each other as if it's a get-together and discuss people's concerns with sincerity and gusto? Well, we are able to do that, and also find a little bit of humour sometimes, because if you just go through a whole hour being very serious, you might as well be listening to Radio 4. It's 18 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
It's 22 minutes past 8. Let me reintroduce you to our panel. Thangam Debbonaire is Shadow Leader of the House of Commons, Labour MP for Bristol West. Dame Caroline Dinenage is Conservative MP for Gosport. Do you like being a dame?
Oh, I haven't settled into it yet. It's quite new.
So Christopher Hope, future. Sorry, we mustn't laugh. Andy won't like it. Associate Editor for Politics of the Daily Telegraph and host of Chopper's Politics podcast, which is incredibly successful, isn't it, Chris?
Yes, it is. Thank you. And not as your many podcasts, Ian, but I do my best.
I think it probably is, actually. I think you probably get more downloads than I do. And John McTernan, do you have a podcast, John? Everyone has one.
No, but I should be a peer, but Tony didn't have a resignation on his list. A peer.
Didn't you have one?
No.
Gosh.
Gordon and Tony didn't have
all those years you gave up of your prime years.
Also, the big scandal about me as well.
Should we go into that?
No. It seemed appropriate that I became a peer.
Right, let's go to another question. Munesh is in Southwell. Hello, Munesh.
Hello, Ian, and welcome to the panel. I'm glad to see you all having a laugh. It's been a while, but I'm impressed. I'm just, the question I ask you, is this a question of colonization 2022, when you want to attack countries like India for climate change, when the Western world have caused all these problems, they've industrialized themselves? Isn't this like closing down the drawbridge and saying, look, you guys can do what you want, but you're going to have to pay for it? It doesn't make sense at all. I'd like to hear the panel's view on that.
Okay, John McTernan.
Look, I think we do have a historic responsibility to India because of our involvement in India and what we did and what we left behind. A very mixed legacy at the least. But I also think that as a major country in the world, India, as a major economy, a growing economy, has a role to play as a leading nation, demonstrating that it can be a 21st century country, can grow the economy, make the country richer, and remove carbon from the economy. It's a future for everybody to decarbonise, but in particular in Southeast Asia, some of the biggest risks of flooding, some of the lowest level of people, high population living right by the sea, in the most in danger. So if action isn't taken by the Indian government and by the Bangladeshi government and by the governments of the region, then it is populations there who will be displaced, who will suffer. So this isn't a case of one country opting out and other countries not opting in. We all have to work together. That's why we were discussing earlier on about the need for a range of world leaders, all the world leaders to be there. However difficult it is, this is the one crisis that confronts every country in the world.
Caroline.
Yeah, no, I find myself violently agreeing with virtually all of that. It's, as I said at the top of this, there's literally no doubt that the UK was at the front end of the Industrial Revolution, but the fact is we are where we are and we have to come together as a world to solve the problems that face us all. And, and whether that's working as a world to sort of raise the money to support the lower income countries who are in many cases suffering the worst impacts of climate change as we see it at the moment, or whether that's working with bigger countries, and India is now a huge, fast-growing, very heavily industrialised country who has to play their part in solving this problem.
Chris.
Yeah, there's got to be a distraction from what India must do. I think that, I think we do have an aid budget, 0.5% of GDP, and some of that does go towards it. I think if I were in government, I'm not in government at all, of course, supporting...
Can only be a matter of time.
These low-lying islands from flooding is what I would do. I would try and channel the money into where it's required. The problem with...
building a royal yacht.
Well,
to help people get off the island.
You've lost that one, haven't you?
The national flagship has been temporarily scuppered below the waterline.
The campaign goes
by
on.
the short-sighted Ben Wallace today in the House of Parliament.
Maybe Labour could bring it back. Maybe that would be a great...
They axed the
we might. I've just been told in my ear we have a question on that later, so I should have done that. But anyway.
But briefly, I think that targeted help is important, definitely. But I don't think the fact is that historically we generated 3% of carbon emissions. Pakistan is 0.3%, so I get that. But equally, China 11% and rising, as I said. So I think there are issues there for other countries. They can't avoid what they should take responsibility for.
And well, I think that, to sum up some of that and to add to it, everybody's affected and everyone's involved. So regardless of who started it or who did what when, everybody needs to be there because we've all got a role in solving it. And India has, I am slightly biased, but India has amazing scientists and great creativity. But also the Indian East Coast, where my family lives, has been affected by floods for many, many years. So it is in India's interest, it's in China's interest to be at the table, but actually it's in all of our interest that as many players as possible are with us, both from the private sector and from government sector at COP27, helping to make progress. And earlier on, Caroline talked about sort of inching and slowly, and I don't think that's what you want it to be, but I think sometimes it can feel that way, hence why commentators like Greta Thunberg say what they say. But we have to inch quicker, and we are going to do that better if we do have the big players as well as the small players.
Do you think that the Western media has a bit of blame attached to itself here? Because if there is a flood in the United States that kills 10 people, it's headline news in the Western media. If there is a flood in Bangladesh that kills thousands of people, it's not headline news. It's regarded as something that was quite normal. And okay, it's more difficult to get pictures, I guess, from countries like Bangladesh, maybe. But I wonder whether there needs to be a reappraisal of editorial priorities. Thangam.
Well, I would like there to be greater coverage of the impacts of climate change across the world, yes, because I think that would help mobilise us more, all together. And when we don't all have an equal role to play here, there are some parts of the world, and you mentioned Bangladesh, that are suffering much worse than us. Our floods, however, will be like Bangladesh's if we don't get a move on. And I think that's the other reason it might be useful in our own self-interest, as well as in compassionate interest in what's happening in Bangladesh, for people to see this is what's ahead of us. This is what's ahead of us. Now, for Bangladesh, and as I said, large chunks of the Indian East Coast, there will be no going back. And there is only halting. It's very unlikely they will ever recover to where they were before. And I think that ought to be a warning to all of us. But also, as I said, because there is that creativity and dynamism in the Indian economy, they have an enormous contribution to make. And I don't think it's about wanting more aid. I think it's about wanting them to contribute.
Chris, do you think that it would take a major environmental disaster in the West? I mean, say, for example, the North Norfolk coast was inundated and the house was completely flooded. That would be a major disaster for me. But that would be maybe a wake-up call for everybody.
But almost certainly, I think something like that happening here would drive it to the top of the political agenda. That's difficult. The problem you have, I think, with what you're describing, Thangam, is that people do turn off from being lectured all the time about as they see it.
I don't think we need to lecture people.
And that can. I know that even David Attenborough, Saint David Attenborough on the BBC, when he goes off on his Good Version Planet programme.
But I think what Ian was talking about was reporting the news.
This kind of issue in just a second.
It's a real issue it's a real issue in London. The Thames barrier is lowered far more frequently because we are getting impact of floods and flooding coming. The thing is, two-thirds of global GDP is produced on coasts, on rivers, or in deltas. So we've developed as a global economy, so we're all exposed to rising water levels.
Sam in Cambridge has got a counter to that tweet from Andy, who didn't like us laughing. Says, to the person who said stop laughing, this is virtually the only station that doesn't sit back and allow MPs to get across the sound bites that they've directly planned. It's done excellently with a balance of serious remarks and laughter. Somebody finally appreciated it. There we go. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to take part in our programme and ask our panel a question. It's 8:31 on LBC. Time for the news headlines with Josh Bancroft.
The UK is tripling the amount it contributes to help nations cope with the impact of climate change. Rishi Sunak has addressed delegates at the COP27 climate summit in Egypt, where he has confirmed that spending will increase to £1.5 billion. 23 people have been arrested after climate protesters brought the M25 to a standstill earlier today. Members of Just Stop Oil climbed up on gantries over the motorway. And midterm elections are taking place in the United States tomorrow. Republicans and Democrats are making their final bids for votes before polls open. LBC weather, rain in the west, easing as it moves eastwards overnight, leaving clear spells and blustery showers, a low of 8. Windy with a mix of sunshine and showers tomorrow. Some thundery and heaviest in the west, a high of 14 degrees.
This is LBC.
I'm
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Noise, right?
Welcome back to Cross Question. Thangam Debbonaire, Caroline Dinenage, Christopher Hope and John McTernan with us answering your questions. Let's go to a text question from John in Pinner. Is Just Stop Oil becoming a cult of fear? A question I could have written myself, but I didn't. Caroline Dinenage, we've had more protests today, climbing on the gantries. This video that a lot of our listeners will have heard or seen over the course of the day of this young girl literally in tears over it all. What's your view?
Well, my view is that they have got some very rational beliefs that they want to try and convey, but they are, if you want to try and get people on your side, they're just going completely the wrong way about it by stopping people from going about their day, getting to their hospital operations, getting their kids to school, looking after their carers, looking after their loved ones. You know, all you do is get people's backs up and get them to stop listening to your message. And I just think it's utterly counterproductive, and you know, and sometimes the demonstrations take the form of campaigning against some of the most environmentally friendly. You know, remember when we were sort of gluing ourselves to trains, you know, which actually are a very environmentally friendly form of transport compared to the alternative.
Yeah, there was that one of the Docklands Light Railway, wasn't there? And you thought, well, I mean, that surely is an environmentally friendly form of transport.
Yeah, and you know, so what are they trying to do? So are they trying to be sort of anarchists, or are they actually trying to achieve a goal? And either way you look at it, you don't get people to come round to your way of thinking by really, really annoying them.
Thangam, do you think that often in these environmental protests that they start off, I mean, I remember when Extinction Rebellion started, even sort of crusties on the right like me thought that's actually a really innovative way of doing it, and we all thought, well, good on them. You may not necessarily agree with them, and then they get taken over by the trots.
I think the thing is, protest is a good thing. Being passionate about a cause, which is probably the biggest cause that we all share, is a good thing. Caring about it is a good thing. As Caroline said, there are some really rational purposes and thinking there. However, what concerns me sometimes is the idea seems to have been fed to some, particularly young people, and I get this in schools when I visit, that nobody's doing anything, which is just not true. And I think I'm not just arguing that from a point of view of fairness to different governments. I mean, goodness knows I've criticised Caroline's government plenty of times and will do so again. I think it's because it's just not helpful for campaigning to say nobody's doing anything, partly because it gives the idea that campaigning doesn't get you anywhere. Campaigning on the environment brought about the world's first Climate Change Act under, one Ed Miliband, who was the world's first Climate Change Secretary, and any number of things that have happened since then with successive governments. I would like this government to go further, but I think it's deeply unhelpful for campaigners to give other campaigners the idea that unless you do something very, very destructive, no government will lift a finger, when that's just not true.
Stephen in East Grinstead has actually called in on this, but it's a similar line to John in Pinner. He says, should they give Louise Harris, that was the girl in question on this video, should they give her a BAFTA for her performance today? Christopher Hope.
It's a bit mean. I mean, she's upset, and she's a young girl, so I feel sorry that she's upset. I think it looks strange. What's happening here is people are acting outside of the normal democratic processes, and it's a shock to the rest of us who try and abide by those and live within those confines. I think that, you know, we are going in the right direction now, and it is winding up people and serving to go against what they want to do. I feel very sorry for van drivers held up on the way to work. They get paid if they turn up. If they don't turn up, there's real anger out there, and that's why the police are being much harder on this and raiding premises overnight. And we saw Mark Harper, the Transport Secretary, take out some degree of injunctions against this kind of behaviour we saw today. So I think a lot of people...
Didn't work though, did it?
Well, it may work eventually, but it's a start.
John, I think you have a slightly different view.
Yeah, I'm all for this, to be honest. I was a punk in the 70s. I think I agree with George Bernard Shaw. Progress is only made by unreasonable people, and there's an existential crisis. We could see within a century it impossible to live on this planet. Young people are worried by this, deeply worried by it, because it's a thing we should be all worried about. And for me, the other thing about young people is they're meant to annoy us. Like, they really are meant to. They're meant to revolt against us. And we've been so tolerant as an older generation. You know, your kids can stay with you, the kids can have the girlfriend stay over or the boyfriend stay over, they can live with you, they can leave and come back. We've had a situation where there's nothing that the older generation do that younger people can revolt against. And they found an issue where they can now actually go for us and go, come on,
but
John, can I have you?
How many are there, though? I mean, it's a pretty small number of people that take part in these protests. They're not representative, are they?
You only need... there's some science on this. You only 3,000 to 4,000 people willing to go to jail to make a major social movement have an impact. Because once you start arresting people and filling cells up, the system has to adapt.
But annoying people is one thing, but these people are preventing people from accessing life-saving operations. But I was reading one tweet today that said a consultant was unable to get to hospital to perform an operation. They're stopping people picking up little children from school, causing distress and causing huge upset, and in some cases causing harm. And that, to me, does not get people to believe and follow your cause.
But also, the thing that troubles me is and I'd really like to know what you think of this, John, because what troubles me is that someone's clearly giving some of the young people the idea that nobody's doing anything, and I think that's deeply unproductive for them. Yeah. Because you need to feel that campaigning might actually achieve some change, and if they think that campaigning only achieves nothing, then that's also unproductive. I think campaigning is incredibly important on this most important of issues.
To be honest, the view of young people is not focused on the entire political class. It is focused on the fact that for 12 years we've had a government which is deeply riven on the issue of acting on climate change.
Agreed.
And has resolved that question of internal party political management by and large against tackling climate change. Look at removing the fuel duty escalator. Yes. It's lost 50 to 60 billion pounds of tax revenue to the government, undermine public services, and at the same time take away a price signal that would actually get people to be moving out of cars and into public transport.
And save people in rural communities who actually need cars to get around.
We're going to have to move faster to EVs. EVs are by far the fastest way to move around.
Oh, don't get me started on that.
Range anxiety in.
But we'd also talk about...
not in rural communities.
But we could talk about the fact that the after Rishi Sunak as Chancellor finally took a bit of Labour's idea on windfall tax, he managed to turn it into a subsidy on oil and gas.
That's true.
Completely the wrong thing to do.
Have fun, Thangam. That's how you're coming across.
I criticised him. I totally criticised him.
Right, let's move on to another question. It's from James in Ayrshire. Hello, James.
Oh, hello, Ian. Nice to speak to you again. Good evening to the panel. My understanding is that there's been no effective government in Northern Ireland for several months now. Has anybody noticed any difference?
You could have asked the same question in Belgium, where they went without a government for 9 months and the economy went great. Chris Hope.
Well, it's a very good point. It's run by civil servants. I think you have to have elections for some reasons, like I think approving the budget. I think from memory, but there are contentious issues coming up. Or normally there have been during the marching season, and they passed over. No, it has gone quite well. I mean, let's whisper it quietly. If we had a dictatorship for 50 years here, how would that look? That's not a good idea. Let's not endorse that. But I mean, I can see how you might think that. I think though that you do need to have a degree of democratic wrapper on any government, really, to allow people to say, well, I voted for that party and I can see them either opposing or being in government. I think that is why we are in a democracy. I think it is working okay, but only because it has to. It's not an ideal situation.
John, were you in Number 10 when all the Northern Ireland peace process was going on?
No, I wasn't. No, I wasn't. Although I was in DWP with Harriet. But look, I think there's a number of things going on. The people who notice there's not a government in Northern Ireland are the people who've got fuel poverty, because there's not been an ability to make a decision on a Northern Ireland solution for subsidy for people, because that's a political decision. Civil servants administer past decisions, not future decisions. Right. That's a huge issue. And I think as a Democrat, I do not support Sinn Féin. I support the SDLP. My family are all SDLP in Northern Ireland. But to have the DUP collapsing the government to prevent the First Minister being from Sinn Féin is to hack at the basis of the cross-communal nature of the Good Friday Agreement.
They say they're not doing it for that reason.
Exactly.
Oh, no, it's true. It's what they say. They say very few coherent things. That definite pretext is vaguely coherent. It's not true. Everybody knows it. I was in Belfast.
We want to get a response on something.
I was in Northern 2 weeks ago. People do miss having a government there, particularly for the energy crisis.
Right. Brief answers, if I can, from Thangam and Caroline.
If the decision makers aren't elected politicians, you can't kick the decision makers out, and that's really important. That's the fundamental pillar of democracy, is that whatever you think of any of the methods that we have for electing a democratic government and a parliament, you get the ability to kick them out if you don't like what they're doing. And this way, people are making decisions, and I think apparently at quite modest level, which is another bad thing when it's the part of the country with the longest NHS waiting list.
I wonder whether it's time to revisit the whole structure of government. I mean, I almost hesitate to say this, but the Good Friday Agreement is now 25 years old, or nearly 25 years old. Maybe there ought to be a sort of Good Friday Agreement too in the offing.
Well, it just feels like that everybody just needs to try and come to a solution that's going to work for the people of Northern Ireland. We're not there. We haven't been there for such a long time now. When I was a health minister back between 2018 and 2020, it was when the abortion legislation was going through, and we were stuck in a position where the Department of Health and the Northern Ireland office were having to take decisions about what was happening, not only sort of to the government in Northern Ireland, but to women in Northern Ireland, and it's not sustainable.
Right, we'll come to more of your questions in just a moment. It's 8:46.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
10 to 9, Thangam Debbonaire, Caroline Dinenage, Christopher Hope and John McTernan with me answering your questions. Here's a text question from Ranel in Harpenden. Tory members hate him. He seems to be totally unprofessional and he's never been effective in government. So why is Gavin Williamson getting the Prime Minister's support? I should add to this, he's coming under fire for texts that he sent to the former Chief Whip Wendy Morton, which look quite bullying in tone. Well, Pippa Crerar has got a story in The Guardian this evening saying that a senior civil servant claims Gavin Williamson told them to slit your throat in what they felt was a sustained campaign of bullying while he was Defence Secretary. The Ministry of Defence official told The Guardian Williamson made the extraordinary remarks in front of other civil servants in a meeting and on a separate occasion told them to jump out of the window. Better than to shut up and go away, I suppose. The Whitehall aide, who worked closely with the Cabinet Minister, claimed Williamson deliberately demeaned and intimidated them on a regular basis. Christopher Hope, now, it is not unusual, it has to be said, for politicians to, shall we say, use language that might be considered a little bit extreme, but is everybody being a bit of a snowflake over this?
I think slightly. I mean, I think that MPs don't get many lectures or not helped on how to be a good manager, and clearly saying slit your throat to anybody more junior than you is inappropriate. But I mean, I think we need to take a step back here. I mean, he's in cabinet, one of 5 chief whips in cabinet, to allow Rishi Sunak to control what could be a difficult few weeks for the government going into this autumn statement a week on Thursday. That's why he's there. Yes, he is robust. We had this with Priti Patel. If people can't handle it, move to a different department to a degree. I mean, I think the bullying of Wendy Morton, of course, she was the boss. He was a backbench MP at the time. I think, what he said about the Queen's funeral, he shouldn't be so entitled to think he should be there at all. But I mean, I think people have got an issue about Gavin Williamson, and it's being played out here in the press. I think
they're really going for him now.
Yeah, move on. I mean, it's. I don't think it's enough to get rid of him. I mean, we're in week 3, I think, of the Sunak administration. I mean, it's not going to happen.
Caroline Dinenage, could I have your phone, please? Any text from Gavin Williamson? Have you seen this side of him?
Do you know what? I just never have. Every conversation I've ever had with Gavin, when particularly I used to go and see him quite frequently, as when he was Secretary of State for Education, about issues in my constituency, he was always utterly charming. But the language used in these text messages to Wendy and what you've just read out to colleagues in the Department of Defence is not acceptable. Rishi Sunak today said this language.
But if it's not acceptable, should he be fired?
Well, they're looking into it, aren't they?
What's look into? We've seen the text. There's nothing to investigate.
Personally, I don't think this sort of language would be acceptable in a business environment. It wouldn't be acceptable in a local authority environment. So it's not great, is it?
So you think he should go?
Well, I don't know, it's not my decision, is it? But,
it sounds as if it was.
At the end of the day,
I know what the result would be.
Gavin was a sort of quite a brave choice to be in the cabinet in the first place.
A brave choice, as in the Sir Humphrey use.
Because he's quite a high-profile character. He's definitely a Marmite character, and as Chris said, you can see why he was put in there, because he does come with this experience. He's a former chief whip. He was sort of.
Why was he put in there? Because he's got a job, minister without portfolio. No one actually seems to know what his ministerial responsibilities are.
Yeah, well, I mean, he has got a huge amount of experience, both as a chief whip, but also Secretary of State in a number of different departments to varying degrees of success. But so he has got that expertise and experience. But as I say, there's nothing you can say about the language that can justify it.
Look, I think politics. MPs, the House of Commons, but particularly in ministerial office, is the last place in British life where you can be a bully and not be sacked. The bullying that goes on in politics, the casual nature of it, and the way that people aren't just immediately sacked. We had bullies in the last Labour government, the Blair government, who should have been disciplined and ultimately fired for what they did.
Like the Chancellor.
We had there's behaviour throughout the government. Not a lot, but there was behaviour that's unacceptable. And I don't think the behaviour that's described from the Defence Department is acceptable. And I think the question you said is, if behaviour can be described as not acceptable, there should be a consequence for that. And the consequence should be you shouldn't be in the government. But the Prime Minister's weak and needs that organisation on the back bench.
But at least he didn't throw a mobile phone, Thangam?
The behaviour that Pippa's describing here, though, Ian, actually does break the bullying and harassment code. So we do now have rules. There are possible sanctions. I would expect there to be. That's what I said. The behaviour as described, and therefore. There is a process which didn't exist under that government, and it does now. And it's not just politicians, this is civil servants, according to what Pippa Crerar is saying. If true, as you say, that is civil servants that he's saying that to. And I don't think it's acceptable in any way, shape or form. But unfortunately, Rishi Sunak, he was warned that there might be issues with Gavin Williamson, and he didn't need to be warned about Suella Braverman's appointment because she'd admitted it herself in her resignation letter 6 days previously. This is unfortunately becoming a pattern. You say it's only 3 weeks into Rishi Sunak's premiership, but 3 weeks in which he seems to have made a regular weekly pattern of appointing someone that perhaps he shouldn't have appointed when he could have known and did know.
Simon in Portsmouth says, can anyone on the panel seriously make a compelling case for the Royal Yacht? Now,
there's
Chris,
no case
I'm going to come to you for the third question in a row first, because you have almost been launching a one-man campaign on the Royal Yacht, and you've been scuppered.
It's not a Royal Yacht, it's a national flagship.
Okay.
It's the idea to replace the Britannia, decommissioned by John's government back in '97 by Tony Blair. The idea is to generate trade deals. We've got the quotes overnight from the CEO of Harland & Wolff, which would have built it in possibly in Northern Ireland, and it would develop for all sorts of good money coming to this country. It would have been soft power projection, £250 million, a snip, Iain Dale.
But it would have cost the taxpayer £250 million.
Yes, but it would have got back. It's like Thangam's investment in wind farms. It would pay back over a number of years.
It wouldn't. Oh, come on.
Yes, well, why can't it if yours failed?
It really wouldn't. Well, wind farms generate energy, which then powers people's homes. No, it really, really doesn't. And the idea that we can't do trade deals without a yacht is just ridiculous. And there are other forms of soft power. Other forms of soft power are available, like our creative industries, for instance, which also have the added advantage of generating income directly. I mean, I can't think of any justification for the Royal Yacht whatsoever.
For centuries, going back to Charles I until John's government got rid of it.
We used to have the plague. Is that a good reason to bring it back? No!
That's a winning argument, Thangam.
I love the Britannia. I loved the Royal Yacht Britannia. When I was director of the London Docklands Development Corporation, we hosted many events on the Royal Yacht. It was a great boat. I think it was an act of it's kind of nasty little class warfare to get rid of it. I think it does make a contribution to. We do have a royal family. The Crown shows you that we have an impact culturally with the royal family, soft power. And I actually am for building a British boat to be a flagship for the British state. If global in Britain's to mean anything, it's got to be in every single dimension. It's not simply aid, and it's not simply trade. It's also projecting our royal family. And
because you can't, Caroline, you can't put the king on a cross-channel ferry and invite lots of foreign business dignitaries and expect them to be persuaded, can you?
Well, there are arguments for and against, aren't there? And your question came from a gentleman from Portsmouth. Obviously, that is God's chosen city, as far as I'm concerned. I'm also from Portsmouth, and my grandfather helped build the original Royal Yacht. He worked in the dockyard from the age of 14. So obviously, I have a great deal of sympathy for it. But coming from Portsmouth, and living now in Gosport and looking out over Portsmouth Harbour, I see our 2 aircraft carriers, and they are floating pieces of sort of British sovereign territory. Can go anywhere in the world, and their soft power is remarkable, and I've seen the impact that they have when they pitch up in places like New York, and the amount of stardust.
You are outnumbered. Just on Gavin Williamson, Mike in Stoke says Gavin Williamson is not Marmite. Some people like Marmite. Cutting. Right, final text question from Brenda in Hull. Caroline's dad once presented the fantastic children's show How, which I was a regular viewer of that. You have to be a certain age to remember that. Which kids' TV show would your panellists like to present? Caroline.
Well, So House come back. How is now back as How 3 with my dad making. He does a cameo in it. It's with very much younger.
Just in case, Caroline's dad's Fred Dinenage, who of course also presented the ITV regional news programme for many
That's right,
decades.
and still does his murder casebook programme as well. So so he does a sort of cameo in every episode of the How, which is now on goes on ITV still, but with a slightly younger main cast cohort. So he's still brilliant, my dad. The TV show that I loved from my childhood, which my dad was also on just as a guest once, was Tiz Was. I don't know if any of you remember Tiz Was. It was chaotic. It was anarchy. It was madness. It was just brilliant. It was the sort of TV show you'd never ever. Pied, everybody got pied. It's the sort of show you'd never ever have. Health and safety would just have a meltdown at the prospect of it.
It'd have to be Blue Peter for me. As a kid, I got a Blue Peter badge, a treasured possession of mine. So to get onto the show and to present the show that sent me that badge and made me feel so proud at primary school, that would have to be it for me.
Okay. Thangam?
Well, I was going to say Vision On, and then I remembered I can't draw, and then I thought I'd say Animal Magic, and then I'm not that keen on animals, so I'm going to go for Magic Roundabout just because.
You're not keen on
animals?
Well,
there is actually.
Can I just give you a tip? Never ever say that on the media again.
Why?
Because people will hate you.
Oh, really?
Yes.
For saying that. And it's not that I don't like animals, I'm just not very good with them.
You don't like animals.
Yeah.
I'm just not very good with them. I'm not very good with them.
I'd be a cartoon character on Mr. Ben.
That's good.
And I'd walk into the shopkeeper's house, Mr. Ho, somewhere in the world, with Mr. Ben. Put my hat on.
Great answers. Thank you all very much indeed, to Thangam, to Caroline, to Chris and John. Right, we are going to talk about housing next, because there are great fears that 2023 could be a year of the housing crash, not just in terms of the people who own houses, their houses going down in value, but also lots of landlords are withdrawing from the market for all sorts of reasons. What impact could that have on you? 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 2 minutes past 9.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock. The Prime Minister has said the amount the UK will contribute to helping other countries deal with climate change will increase to £1.5 billion. Rishi Sunak has addressed delegates at the COP27 Climate Summit in Egypt. Leader of the House of Commons and Labour MP Thangam Debbonaire has told Iain Dale's Cross Questions here on LBC that it's right the UK plays its part.
It's important that as a richer country, we are helping poorer countries with the costs of climate crisis, because we will all be damaged if we don't fix the problems in other countries. It will affect us as well. It will affect us in numerous ways.
Police are warning people who intentionally or recklessly cause public nuisance could face up to 10 years in prison. It comes after 23 people were arrested earlier after Just Stop Oil protesters climbed onto gantries over the M25. It caused disruption across Essex, Kent, Surrey and Herefordshire. A deal to stop migrant crossings is in its final stages, according to the government. The Prime Minister has held talks with the leaders of France and Italy as part of efforts to tackle the problem. It's as questions continue to be asked about conditions at a migrant centre in Kent. Speaking in the Commons, Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick said things are improving at Manston.
I can tell the House that as of 8 a.m. this morning, the population at the Manston facility was back below 1,600. This is a significant reduction from this point last week, with over 2,300 people being placed in onward accommodation.
And it's been confirmed that plans to build a new national flagship to promote British business around the world have been scrapped. The project, which had reached the design stage, was announced by Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister. In the city, the FTSE 100 is closed down 35 points at 7,200. The pound buys $1.15 and €1.15. LBC weather, rain in the west, easing as it moves eastwards overnight, leaving clear spells and blustery showers, a low of 8. Windy with a mix of sunshine and showers tomorrow, some thundery and heaviest in the west, a high of 14 degrees. From Global's newsroom, for LBC, I'm Josh Bancroft.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Five minutes past 9 on LBC. My partner said to me last night, do you realise what our mortgage has gone up to? And he told me what it was. I'm not going to give you the actual figures, but it's gone up £110 over the last month. And next month, I imagine it'll go up by about another £150 because the interest rate that the interest rate rise that the Bank of England announced on Thursday will no doubt feed into the mortgage market. So in 2 months, an extra £250 a month. Now, there'll be a lot of people who were not bargaining on that when they took out their mortgages. And I wonder whether, in that regard, you think that there's going to be some sort of correction in house prices over the course of the next 18 months. Now, that may be good news for some people. If you're a first-time buyer trying to get onto the housing ladder and prices at the lower end of the market come down, well, that will be good for you, I guess. But if you are somebody who's scrimped and saved over the years to afford a deposit, you take out a mortgage, you've looked at interest rates, and over the last 12 years they've been fairly static. And despite some people warning that what goes down can go up again, you might feel a little bit betrayed, I suppose, and think, well, I bought this asset and I could be in negative equity. When I bought my first flat in Walthamstow back in 1988, within 2 years, I was in negative equity. And I think, in fact, I sold the flat 10 years later for exactly what I paid for it. I must be the only person who bought property in the 1980s and not to make any money out of it, but there we go. But it's not just that I want to talk about. It's also the buy-to-let market and the rental market, because there could be the most catastrophic events happening in that market over the course of the next year or two. And the reason I say that is because somebody I know who is an estate agent sent me an email last week. And I'm going to read it out to you because it really struck fear into me. It said, "This is a huge news story coming. Landlords are getting out. I've had 2 calls within an hour of that interest rate rise from 2 wanting to sell. Many landlords and homeowners will have to sell in 2023 when they have to renew their loan and cannot afford it. Landlords getting out, rents rocketing, and still I've had over 100 inquiries for a 3-bedroom house rental recently. It's an imminent total disaster. Biggest housing crisis in modern history. People are leaving because their own landlords are selling, then phoning me in a panic. They and I have no idea where they will soon live. Buy-to-let has covered up for lack of social housing, and now the tide is going out to reveal the wreckage. Literally hundreds of thousands of people soon to be without homes. People phoning me up crying. Landlords all selling up. A total disaster happening in 2023, and it's starting now. You heard it here first." Well,